No? OK. So ThoughtWorks is a global consulting company. I feel really bad like doing a plug, but I feel like something to do for 5 minutes. Yeah, so I'll give you the plug now, and then I won't have to do the plug during the talk. How about that? We're a global consulting company. We help our customers build custom software and get better at the practice of building software. You may know us for from such movies as Selenium, NUnit. We do like a bunch of open source work. Yeah, I don't know. Come talk to me if you're interested in learning more about ThoughtWorks, or if you want to apply for a job at ThoughtWorks or find out more about it. I'm trying to decide if I should start now, since the room is full.
Yep.
I'm just going to start. If you wanted to be here, you'd be here by now. All right. I'll take it slower, and maybe we can have some questions at the end. So this is not a talk about the latest asynchronous micro framework called different.js. If you think it is, then you can go ahead and leave. But please stick around, because I think it's still an important topic. So what I want to talk about is how we get better at things over time. Something that's pretty important to us as software developers, because, well, important to us as people, I would say. It's good to get better at stuff. Maybe some of us feel that this is kind of the path to getting better at things over time. You do stuff, you practice, you get more experience, practice makes perfect, you kind of incrementally get better at something as you progress. I don't really think this is true. This isn't really the path that my kind of learning and improvement has taken. For me, it's more like this. When I start learning a new thing, and I get this like initial kind of rush of learning, right? Like I discover Sass, or I discover jQuery, and when I first start, I'm going really slow in terms of productivity, but I'm learning really fast. And like every day, it's like a new thing I'm learning, and it's amazing, and it's super, and it's wonderful. Over time, what happens is I start getting more productive in this new thing, but my rate of learning actually kind of drops off, and I start to kind of plateau. And then like something else happens that kicks me out of this rut, and I start learning again. So I start playing with some new tool, or I read this amazing blog post, or I go to an awesome conference talk, and I kind of level up, right? So that's the way I actually think we learn, is we find something cool, it kind of kicks us out of our rut, and we level up as programmers. And if this is how we learn, and this is how we improve, I think it's really important for us to figure out how we can hit these leveling up points more often. Like, how can we arrange our lives, arrange the work that we do, so that we level up more frequently? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, is arranging our lives so that we can level up more often in JavaScript. I already did the plug about my company. Last plug about my company, we get to pick our job titles, so that's cool. Yeah, actually my job title at ThoughtWorks is @PH1, glorified typist, because it was the only way I could figure out getting my Twitter handle on my business cards. So yeah, there you go. So I want to spend some time talking about this. So we can, before I start talking about this, I want to talk about, I'm talking about leveling up. And one of the classic ways that, who here has read the Pragmatic Programmer's book? OK, those of you without your hands up, you should go and buy that book and read it. Really, really great book. And one of the pieces of advice, classic piece of advice from that book, is learn a new programming language. And I really agree with this idea. By kind of stretching our brains and thinking about things in a different way by using a different programming language, you kind of look at the world a little bit different. And when you come back to your regular programming language, let's say you go and learn Prolog, and you go and kind of figure out all about logical programming, even if you're not going to apply that in your day-to-day, when you come back to JavaScript, you look at things differently, and you kind of have this new perspective on the world. You've kind of stretched your brain, and when you let go, things snap back, but they don't snap all the way back. So you've kind of leveled up a little bit. So this is really good, a really good practice and a really good suggestion. But what I want to talk about today is not about leveling up by going outside of JavaScript, but by changing how we use JavaScript to expand our minds a little bit. So using the same language that we use every day, but using it in a different way in an attempt to level up. So I'm going to take a little moment to talk about this in JavaScript. This is how I often feel about this. I feel like this about this because of things like this. So we, as JavaScript programmers, I think this is OK. I had just gave a talk just recently, like an hour ago, where I said that we have Stockholm Syndrome. If we think that, oh, yeah, well, of course you have to take this and assign it to self so that inside of here, the closure of the lexical, blah, blah. We have Stockholm Syndrome if we think this is OK. It's an artifact of the fact that JavaScript was built in 10 days and is an amazing thing for being built in 10 days. But I really dislike things like this. Even if you understand why you have to do it and really get the kind of the confusing lexical scope stuff, it still trips you up and it still just kind of gets in your way, in my opinion. And it makes me a little bit embarrassed every time I have to explain this to someone who's not a JavaScript programmer. So hopefully you agree with me that at least that this can be annoying in some contexts. And so given that, and given the fact that we're looking for ways to look at JavaScript differently in an attempt to expand our kind of programming minds a little bit, we're going to see what happens when we don't use this. So we're going to try and expand our JavaScript minds a little bit by programming JavaScript without prototypes and without this. So to talk about how we can avoid using this, we need to take a step back and say, why are we using this in the first place? We're using this because we like to do kind of some type of object-oriented programming. So my kind of working definition for the purposes of this talk of object-oriented programming is it's about state and behavior traveling together through time. So that sounds a little hand-wavy. What does that actually mean? So here's a person. This person is called George. George has the ability to eat cake. And we can ask George if he's still hungry. So this is the API that we're going to be talking about today, a person type that can eat cake and can still be hungry. Or we can ask him if he is still hungry, him or her. Now, if you kind of think of it, what do I mean by kind of traveling together through state and time, this OO thing? Well, if at some point at the beginning of our program, we kind of instantiate George, and then at some point later on in the program, George eats some cake, and then at some other point in the program, we ask George if he's still hungry. These are all threaded together. So even though the George that we're interacting with later in the program has kind of moved through time since we've last interacted with him, he still has kind of a connection back to his past self. What happens to George when we ask him to eat cake has an effect on what happens when we call that still hungry method. This sounds kind of obvious, kind of maybe really obvious, but in the act of trying to program without using this really, I kind of had this epiphany as this is what OO is about I do something over here and change the state of something, and then when I do something over here, that state change is still in effect. So that to me is like what epitomizes OO and what makes OO so powerful. So let's see how we would build this kind of API in kind of classical JavaScript. So here we have a person constructor function. Of course it's a constructor function because it starts with a capital P. We all know that. And there's two methods on the person prototype. And we have a method that keeps track of the cakes eaten. And we have a method to check whether George is still hungry. Has he eaten less than 3 cakes? And implied is that cakes eaten is part of our public API. I'm not that happy about that. But there's nothing really I can do about it. Now cakes eaten is just hanging out on my public API without me wanting to do that. But that's what we get when we use this. So the point that what we're trying to do here is not use this. So how can we accomplish the same behavior, build the same API without using this, without using prototypes? So here's one way we can do that. we have a CreatePerson kind of constructor function. And when we call that function, we create a new cakes eaten variable. And then we return this kind of object literal. And that object literal has two functions on it. It has a function that increments cake or increments our counter. And it has a function that checks whether that counter is less than 3. So this has almost the exact same behavior as our prototype-based implementation. But it's not exposing that cakes eaten variable. And it's carrying that thread that connects things through time, that object-oriented principle of state and behavior traveling through time, is accomplished not by throwing state onto our object, but by closing over that cakes eaten state. So we're not using prototypes and this to access states. Instead, we're using kind of functional closures and closing over the state of our program. So that's the big difference. And the API is essentially the same. Let's take a moment to rail on this a little bit more. So here's my this-based, my prototypical-based API. Here's George. George is going to eat a lot of cake. That is a lot of cake. Coffee cake, cheesecake, bundt cake, angel cake. And we're going to iterate through that array and make George eat all of those cakes. Now, clearly, after eating that many cakes, George won't be hungry, right? If we call still hungry, it's actually going to return true. Apparently, George is still hungry even after eating all 4 of those cakes. And if we ask George how many cakes he's eaten, he's actually eaten 0 cakes. So who can explain to me where the bug is with my API? Why am I apparently not changing my variable?
It's not a function call.
What's that?
It's George.eatcake is not a function call.
George.eatcake is a function, and I'm passing it to this for each facility that's in array. The this variable. So for each is a function which takes a function, and it also takes a binding, right? Obviously, we all knew that. If you don't tell that for each thing what context to use, it's just going to call that eatcake function. But this is going to probably be window, because JavaScript was written in 10 days. Right? So what we're actually doing is we're incrementing the cakes eaten variable on the browser window, which is not exactly the functionality we were looking for. And the argument I'm making, or the point I'm making here, is this is not intuitive. This feels right to me, but it doesn't work the way I want because this has some really strange kind of functionality, and we have to do a bunch of stuff with binding to make it work correctly. Questions about that before I move on? OK, here is the, annoying. Here is the closure-based approach. Pretty much the same. We create a George person, and we make him eat a bunch of cake. If we do this using closures, this just works because we're not using this. So because that function, that eat cake function, is closing over the state, that state travels together with that function through time, and things work the way I would expect them to work. So this is a trippy thing where functional kind of JavaScript and using closures is actually more OO than our OO-based or our prototypical-based approach. So I could keep going with this. You can actually use this approach, this closure-based approach, to implement something pretty close to OO programming. You can kind of do something close to inheritance. You can use this kind of idea of mix-ins to kind of mix in shared functionality. You get a lot of you get the core things that you want from OO without the drawbacks of this. But what have we learned here? So for me, the big learning is you don't need prototypes, and you don't need this keyword, in order to do OO JavaScript. But I've also kind of starting to think, well, do we even need OO in the first place? Like, why can't I just use functions? Like, is there really that much benefit in having objects carrying state around when I can just have functions carrying state around? So this is what I mean by saying we stand here today thinking that we have to do prototypical things. If we stretch our minds by forcing ourselves to do something a different way, when we look back at where we were, we have a slightly different perspective. And now we can go back to our day-to-day programming maybe, and we've a slightly different view of the world. We've got probably a slightly deeper understanding about how the internals of JavaScript work. And we've also got essentially more tools in our toolbox. So because I've used this closure-based approach rather than a this-based approach, that doesn't mean that I have to throw all of my approach types away and never do prototypical inheritance. But it means I've got one more tool in my toolbox. Before I tried doing JavaScript a different way, I kind of had a hammer and everything was a nail. By experimenting and trying something using a different technique, that might mean that next time I see a screw, I reach for my screwdriver rather than pounding away with the nail. And that's the key kind of point that I wanted to make in this talk, is the way that we can level up without leaving JavaScript is to try using JavaScript in a different way. Sometimes that will mean that we find a new tool that we can use every day. Sometimes you'll discover that what you're doing is really stupid and you really don't want to ever use this experimental approach ever again. But you've still learned something, and you get more of an understanding for JavaScript as a language rather than just using it as a tool that can only do one thing. You start thinking about things rather than just jQuery and how does jQuery work. You start understanding that there's a distinction between jQuery and JavaScript, and you start thinking, well, I understand why I have to say self equals this or this equals self or whatever. So this is about leveling up. And the point I'm trying to make is that we can level up without leaving JavaScript. We can become better JavaScript developers and better programmers in general without leaving our language. I've used this one example of the this keyword and kind of prototypical inheritance. There's a bunch of different ways that I think we could level up. So we can try writing JavaScript without ever returning any values from a function. That sounds stupid. It really is a thing that you can do. It's kind of called tell, don't ask. It's not something I would probably recommend you do in your production code, but it's certainly something I would recommend if you want to stretch your brains a little bit. Write functions that only ever take one parameter. You're not allowed to write a function that takes more than one parameter. Do not allow a function to be longer than 5 lines long. Test first everything. If you don't write tests today, force yourself to do TDD for every single line of code you write. Or, if you write TDD at the moment, don't write any tests at all. So the point here is not that there's a place we want to get to. I personally am a big fan of testing, but I'm not saying we all need to write tests so that we learn how to do testing. What I'm saying is we need to try doing things a different way so that we appreciate both the thing that we're trying and the thing that we used to do but don't do anymore. This is how we level up. Experiment with using immutable objects. So what would happen if you weren't allowed to mutate state in your program and you had to always return copies of things? This is something that sounds silly, but it's something that a closure programmer or a functional programmer is very comfortable doing every working day of their lives. Do we need methods? Can we just write functions that take these immutable objects and mutate and return copies rather than having objects that travel around? Functional reactive is something I gave a talk on earlier today. I think this is a really exciting way of changing how we look at JavaScript and exploring some of these functional ideas without having to leave the comfort of JavaScript as a language. So my point is not that you should do this thing or that thing or the other thing. My point is, if you want to level up, if you want to get better at what you're doing, do more than just reading yet another blog post about the latest framework. You'll learn a bit more about the framework, but you're not necessarily going to level up as a programmer. Yes, keep up to date with React or Bacon or whatever else, but also look for opportunities to just stretch your brain as a programmer. Maybe learn another language, that would be great. But also just think about doing things a different way in JavaScript. You don't have to do it in your production code. You can go and find an open source library that you haven't used before and try using it. Or come up with a little internal tool and write it just with functions that are less than 5 lines long or whatever. I'm not saying that these are the only things to do, but I'm saying that we should spend more of our time sharpening our saws. We should spend more of our time thinking about how to do things differently so that we're better at our software overall. And that is a very short, or quicker than I expected, version of my talk. Thank you. Questions either about the this-based thing or about the overall concept? Yes?
So what's the difference between the kind of factory method that you did there and having a constructor function with just a var set in there and you set the functions onto this?
Same. This is the difference is that when you're setting things on this, it means that A, everything is bound to that. So if you're not passing that binding around, then things aren't going to work the same way. And B, it's all exposed. You're exposing your privates.
Right, but if you use a var parameter in there and then close over those on your functions, then...
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
So would you actually recommend a closure-based approach to objects, given that you create copies of them?
Yes, so I get this question a lot, like, isn't this kind of less effective from a memory point of view because you're creating copies of each function? Definitely less performant than a prototype-based approach. I would argue it's more performant for the team, so I don't really care about the CPU. I care about the productivity of my developers way more than I care about how effective the CPU is going to be. If you take a technique that's less efficient, but gives you a 20% boost in productivity, you can use that 20% boost, that 20% extra time you get, to find the 1% of your program where performance actually matters and optimize the crap out of that. So by optimizing for developer productivity, not for CPU efficiency, you're going to make faster code because you can actually get some free cycles to find the 1% of your program where performance matters. Almost all of our programs, the performance doesn't matter. It's a very small chunk of the code. It's probably the way that you're talking to the DOM. It's nothing to do with JavaScript anyway. So it's definitely less effective. It's definitely less efficient, but I don't think it matters. I think it does matter that it's more efficient for a development team. Other questions? Yeah?
So I might have missed it just saying it way before, but with the for each example, why don't you just do a bind this?
Yeah, that's how you would fix it. I'm not sure that everyone in the room understood that. And so my argument is not that it's fundamentally broken. Once you've rammed your face against it a few times, then you learn the pain. But just because, if I had a steering wheel where every time I touched it, it gave me an electric shock, eventually I would learn to wear gloves. But why don't I get a new steering wheel, right? That's my point is that I think as programmers, we feel like it's okay for things to be broken too much. We don't take a step back and say, can I do this a different way? And that's I guess, kind of what I'm trying to get at is rather than being like, oh, yeah, well, of course, this binding, maybe we can change the way we think about things so that it's no longer an issue. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Is there a particular language you would say has helped you think the most outside of the box in JavaScript?
Particular language. So for me, a different language that has helped, and it's more just because I happen to have done it, is Scala, because I've happened to have been on a project that did Scala. I think Scala, Clojure, Haskell if you're a masochist, Prolog if you're a masochist. So what I would say is don't learn Lua, right? Don't learn something that's close to JavaScript, because that's not, you're going to get a tiny bit of perspective, but you're not going to get the crazy floating 10 feet in the air perspective that you get after you kind of become one with Haskell or whatever, right? So I would say just find something that's not like your day-to-day. Try to do things intentionally differently. Yeah. I have a question.
Okay, so say for example, for each or jQuery coerces this, and thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's exactly my point. Is I don't. If I'm using this, then I have to think about that. So if I'm using this, I have to worry about what jQuery is doing with this or what for each is doing with this. With closures, they by language design, no one can mess with the binding. That has some downsides. It's actually a lot fiddlier to test this kind of stuff, and sometimes I want to mess around with the binding context. But if I use closures, I know that the thing I'm passing the function into can't mess with the scope of the closure, the thing I'm closing over. So that's one of the big wins. Is you don't have to think like, oh, is jQuery going to be involved? I better call self.this or self equals this or whatever.
No, I was referring to the actual this inside, say, in a for each. I mean, so you're not referencing this inside the for each or function or
right.
this in the jQuery.
Yeah, if you don't do that, then you don't have the problem. But if, like in that example, I would need to. So in this example, if I wanted to get this to work, using prototypical based things, I'd have to add an anonymous function. I can't just say like make George eat cake. I have to say make George eat cake. Oh, and also using this anonymous function, or I have to do the comma and then tell it what to bind to. Either way, I have to like explicitly say what object I want to operate on, even though it's right there. It says George dot. Like, why do I have to tell it that? No. Yes.
You mentioned, I mean, this is all super interesting technical stuff that I'm interested in. You mentioned something about your team and sort of productivity. I guess sort of a simple question is, when you're working on these kinds of things and leveling up, how do you decide, or how do you limit maybe your team trying to go out and use these new things, or where do you kind of
Gotcha.
that's too much of a fringe? How do you make a decision on how far to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. I mean, I wouldn't force someone who doesn't care enough about what they're doing to spend some time outside of their 9 to 5 learning something. I wouldn't try and force them. Like that kind of developer, honestly, I don't think that they're only gonna level up by you like ramming them into leveling stuff up. I would be looking for someone who, for the people in my team, and hopefully it's all of the people in my team that are passionate about their craft and they actually want to get better, maybe giving them some guidance on like, oh, that's cool. Like, it's great that you're learning, you know, we're writing an Angular app. We're going to be writing an Angular app for a few years, and you're learning React on the side. That's awesome, and it's probably going to make you think about things a bit differently. Another thing that you could try is learning a different language or something, right? Like focusing people's innate desire to get better and making it more useful getting better. But I don't know. Yeah, that's kind of a hand-wavy answer. I don't have a really good answer to it.
I ask because I'm always experimenting with all this stuff too, and sometimes I'm like, oh, that was too far, that was a big waste of time. So.
I only think it's a waste of time if it hasn't changed the way I think about anything at all. Even if it's nothing productive, but just like it expands my mind a little bit, I think it's still beneficial. Maybe not as beneficial as some other practice, but I still think it was beneficial. There was
I guess my question is kind of related. I guess when you talk about sort of developer productivity in terms of, you know, like say your team one, you to sort of understand sort of, I guess my question is, how do you determine, say, a lead or someone who's trying to make these kinds of decisions, whether, for example, your team is better off not having to understand why, you know, they might be fine as opposed to, well, I mean, you could hide that, like you said, you could hide that in all kinds of ways, and there are all kinds of ways to hide it. But is that actually better for your team as a whole from a productivity perspective?
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess I think I would use some empirical judgment and just kind of say, like, how often has this come up while pairing with someone or during code review, or how often has this caused a bug? And so, you know, like if this is causing issues once a week or once a month or something like that, then it's obviously something we need to work on. If it's something that some people are never gonna, if you have someone who's mainly doing HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript, I wouldn't like say you need to understand all of the lexical scoping rules or whatever. I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that either, to be honest. Like when it gets to the people stuff, it's so context specific. It's not as easy as programming, unfortunately. Any more questions? I have a question for everyone here. How many of you use the this and prototype style of JavaScript? Okay. And how many of you use this closure-based kind of more functional style? This is so interesting. It's like split half and half. Every time I've given this talk, it's the same thing.
What if you use both?
Yeah, I mean, I raise my hands for both. I use both. I use them in different contexts, but it's just interesting to me that it's split half and half. And it was, yeah, anyway. Okay, if there are any more questions, raise your hand. Otherwise, thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Yeah. When I have to interact with jQuery, when I have to interact with the outside world, I'll bridge into OO, prototype in this. If it's internal stuff inside my own business logic, I want it to be functional. I want to use closures instead. Yeah. Any more questions? Feel free to come and ask me. Thanks.